Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional legal, financial, or real estate advice. The historical trends, case studies, and cinematic analyses discussed are for contextual and academic purposes. Real estate transactions, particularly those involving divorce or legal dissolution of assets, carry significant financial and legal implications. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified legal counsel and licensed real estate professionals regarding their specific circumstances. Imagine a world where the very concept of the American dream was still being written in black and white, flickering at 16 frames per second in a cramped, poorly ventilated Nickelodeon. It is 1912. For the average American, the idea of a woman owning property independently is a radical notion, and the idea of a divorce real estate agent is a concept that hasn't even been named yet. But behind the scenes of the burgeoning film industry in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and a dusty outpost called Hollywood, a socio-economic revolution was brewing. The cameras were capturing more than just slapstick comedy and melodramatic rescues. They were documenting the fragmentation of the American family and the subsequent birth of a niche real estate market that remains one of the most recession-proof sectors of the economy today. We are about to uncover a hidden history where the silver screen didn't just reflect society. It actively coached Americans on how to navigate the messy, profitable, and high-stakes world of property liquidation during marital collapse. Historical trends suggest that the rise of cinema and the professionalization of real estate occurred in a synchronized dance. In the early 20th century, the United States was transitioning from an agrarian society to an urbanized industrial powerhouse. This shift led to a massive spike in property values and, perhaps more importantly, a shift in the legal status of marriage. As the new woman emerged in silent films, independent, often single or seeking a divorce, the real estate industry had to pivot. This video is a deep dive masterclass into the intersection of early U.S. cinema and the specialized field of divorce real estate. By the time we reach the end of this 10-part series, you will understand exactly how the visual language of film created the modern real estate marketing machine, and why the divorce agent is the ultimate survivor in any market cycle. This solves a critical problem for modern investors and homeowners, understanding the psychology of distressed property and how to navigate the ethical and financial complexities of assets that must be sold, regardless of what the interest rates are doing. To understand the divorce real estate agent, we must first understand the stage they were born on. In the early 1900s, cinema was the primary medium for social engineering. Case studies of early silent films like The Divorcee, or even earlier shorts from the Edison Manufacturing Company show a recurring theme: the house as a battleground. In the Victorian era, property was often an ancestral monolith, passed down through generations, rarely sold, and almost never divided. However, as the 1910s progressed, the nuclear family began to take center stage. When that nucleus split, the property became a problem that required a new kind of expert. Early real estate agents were often seen as land peddlers, but the complexity of a divorce sale required a mediator, a marketer, and a legal strategist all rolled into one. Let's look at the step-by-step evolution of this niche. In 1910, the U.S. divorce rate was roughly 0.9 per 1,000 people. By 1920, it had jumped to 1.6. This nearly 80% increase created a sudden, desperate need for property turnover. Unlike a standard sale where a family moves because they have outgrown a space, a divorce sale is a forced liquidation. Early cinema capitalized on this drama. Filmmakers realized that the home was the ultimate symbol of stability, and seeing it broken was a powerful narrative tool. This created a cultural feedback loop. As people saw divorce portrayed on screen, the stigma began to erode, and as the stigma eroded, the real estate market for these split assets expanded. The early real estate agent in this context wasn't just selling a house. They were selling an exit strategy. We see this reflected in the way cinema portrayed the home-finding process. In early films, the real estate agent was often a comedic figure or a villainous shark. But as the industry matured, the portrayal shifted toward a professional who could navigate the separate maintenance laws of the time. Potential outcomes for these agents were lucrative because they dealt with a motivated seller. A motivated seller is the cornerstone of any high-volume real estate practice. When two parties cannot stand to be in the same room, the house becomes a liability rather than an investment. The agent who could step in and facilitate a clean break became an essential part of the urban landscape. Consider the Reno divorce phenomenon, which was heavily popularized by early 20th century media. Nevada had some of the most liberal divorce laws in the country, and divorce colonies began to pop up. This created a localized real estate boom. Agents in Reno weren't just selling homes, they were selling short-term residencies that would lead to long-term property liquidations back in the client's home states. Cinema played a massive role in this by glamorizing the Reno trip. While the movie showed the glamorous side of starting over, the reality for real estate professionals was a complex web of title transfers, quitclaim deeds, and the unenviable task of appraising a property while two people fought over the silver. Data from the era suggests that property turnover in burgeoning suburbs was significantly influenced by these domestic shifts. As the film industry moved from the East Coast to California, the Hollywood lifestyle became the blueprint for the American public. This lifestyle included the California bungalow, a house designed for a smaller, more mobile family unit. If the marriage failed, the bungalow was easier to sell than a massive Victorian estate. The real estate agents of the 1920s began to market these homes specifically with resale value in mind, a concept that was relatively new. They were teaching the public that a house was an asset, not a permanent family tomb. This masterclass will examine how the cinematography of early films, using wide shots to show the isolation of a spouse in a large house, or close-ups on the for sale sign, actually taught real estate agents how to stage and market properties. We are talking about the origins of curb appeal as a psychological weapon. When an agent in 1920 took a photo of a listing for a newspaper, they were using the same lighting techniques developed on film sets to make a house look like a fresh start, rather than a failed experiment. Furthermore, we must address the legal evolution. Prior to the mid-20th century, many states required grounds for divorce, such as adultery or cruelty. This meant that the real estate agent was often working alongside private investigators and lawyers. The property wasn't just being sold, it was being used as leverage in a legal war. Early films often depicted this property leverage in high-stakes dramas. The agent had to be a master of discreet liquidation. If a high-profile couple in the silent film era was splitting, the agent had to move the property quietly to avoid a scandal that could ruin a star's career. This gave birth to the pocket listing, a property for sale that isn't publicly advertised, which remains a staple of the high-end divorce real estate market today. As we move forward in this series, we will dissect the specific marketing materials used by 1920s agents, comparing them to the scripts of domestic dramas of the same era. You will see how the language of emotional closure was integrated into real estate copy. We aren't just looking at history. We are looking at the DNA of the modern U.S. housing market. The divorce real estate agent is the unsung architect of the high-velocity market, and their story begins in the flickering shadows of the very first movie theaters. Stay with us as we go deeper into the specific case studies of the 1915 property bubble, and how the divorcee became the most important demographic in the eyes of the early California developers. This is just the beginning of understanding the true cost of the American dream and the professionals who profit from its reconfiguration. To understand this shift, we have to look at the architectural transition from the Victorian family seat to the California bungalow. In the late 19th century, a home was designed to be a permanent, multi-generational anchor. It was heavy, dark, and filled with non-liquid assets. But as the film industry planted its roots in the sun-drenched soil of Southern California, the aesthetic of the American home began to change. Cinema needed sets that were bright, airy, and modular. This aesthetic bled directly into the real estate market. The California bungalow became the first true mass-marketed real estate product designed for the mobile, modern individual. Imagine if you are a woman named Clara in 1924. In the Victorian era, if your marriage ended, you were socially and financially tethered to a massive, crumbling estate that you likely didn't even own the title to. But in the 1920s, influenced by the independent heroine she saw on the silver screen, Clara sees a new potential outcome. She sees a bungalow. It is small, efficient, and most importantly manageable for a single person. Real estate agents of this era, particularly in the rapidly expanding suburbs of Los Angeles, began to realize that their best customers weren't just growing families, but the newly single. Historical trends show that the 1920 California Real Estate Act was a direct response to the need for more professionalized oversight, as these smaller, more frequent transactions began to dominate the market. Early cinema was essentially a 90-minute long-form advertisement for this new way of living. Filmmakers like Cecil B. DeMille didn't just tell stories, they showcased lifestyles. They used high-key lighting to make these smaller homes feel expansive, a technique that real estate photographers in 2026 still use with wide-angle lenses and HDR processing. This cinematic language taught the American public that a house was not a permanent tomb for their ancestors, but a flexible stage for their own personal drama. When a marriage hit the rocks, the real estate agent wasn't just a salesperson. They were the person who helped you strike the set and prepare for the next scene. This leads us to a fascinating case study: the Sears Modern Homes catalog. While not a film company, Sears used the same visual storytelling techniques found in early cinema to sell pre-cut kit homes. From 1908 to 1940, they sold over 70,000 homes. These houses were the ultimate divorce-friendly assets. They were standardized, which meant their value was easy to appraise. In a divorce settlement, having a standardized asset is a godsend for legal counsel and real estate agents alike. It removes the ambiguity of unique value and replaces it with a market-ready price point. Case studies of property disputes in the 1920s often show that these kit homes were the first assets to be liquidated because they were essentially the blue-chip stocks of the housing market. But how did the agents actually reach these people? This is where the intersection of cinema and marketing becomes truly ingenious. In the 1920s, movie palaces were the center of social life. Real estate developers would often buy advertising slides that were projected between films. These slides didn't just show a house. They showed a lifestyle that mirrored the film the audience was currently watching. If the film was a sophisticated comedy about a woman finding her independence, the real estate ad that followed would feature a charming bungalow for the modern woman. They were targeting the divorcee demographic before the term was even widely accepted in polite society. Let's look at the data. By 1926, Los Angeles was seeing a massive influx of what were known as temporary residents. These were people who had moved to California specifically to take advantage of the more relaxed social climate and the burgeoning film industry. This created a high-velocity rental and resale market. Real estate agents in the Hollywood Hills weren't looking for 30-year commitments. They were looking for 18-month flips. This historical trend is a direct ancestor to the fix-and-flip culture we see in 2026. The divorce real estate agent became a specialist in discreet transition. They understood that a quick sale was often more valuable to the clients than a top-dollar sale, as it allowed both parties to move on with their lives and their capital. Step by step, the industry began to formalize the staged home. Early silent film sets were masters of the suggestion of wealth. They didn't build entire mansions. They built flats that looked like mansions from a specific angle. Real estate agents took note. They realized that a house didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to look perfect for the duration of a showing. This was especially critical in divorce sales, where the life had often been drained out of a home. The agent would come in much like a film director and recast the house. They would bring in furniture, improve the lighting, and create a narrative of a happy home for the next buyer, effectively erasing the history of the previous occupants. The psychology here is profound. In 2026, we talk about emotional equity, but this concept was being pioneered in the 1920s by agents who understood that they weren't selling wood and nails. They were selling a new beginning. They were selling the Hollywood ending to someone who had just experienced a mid-movie plot twist. The real estate agent became a secondary character in the client's life story, the one who provides the keys to the next chapter. Consider the impact of the Reno divorce on the real estate market. Nevada's residency requirements were shorter than most states, creating a divorce mill. But what people often forget is that these divorcees in waiting needed somewhere to live for 6 weeks. This created a specialized real estate niche, the high-end, short-term rental. Agents in Reno worked closely with agents in Los Angeles and New York. When a client left their home in New York, the New York agent would handle the liquidation of the marital asset, while the Reno agent would secure the residency property. It was a coordinated, cross-country real estate maneuver that required a high level of professional synchronization. This era also saw the rise of the women's section in newspapers, which were heavily influenced by the fan magazines of the film industry. These sections were filled with advice on home decoration and real estate, often written by or for women. It was a subtle way of educating women on their property rights and the potential outcomes of real estate investment. It was a form of stealth education that gave women the tools to navigate a male-dominated legal system. Now, imagine a character named Marcus in 2026 looking back at this history. He sees that the tactics used by these early pioneers, the focus on lighting, the narrative-driven marketing, the targeting of specific life transition demographics, are the same ones he uses today. But there is a darker side to this history that we haven't explored yet. While the movies were showing the glamorous side of starting over, there was a shadow market emerging. A market where information was the most valuable currency, and where the line between a real estate agent and a private investigator began to blur. What happens when the real estate agent knows about the divorce before the neighbors do? What happens when the agent is the one who tips off the buyers that a house is a must-sell? This is where we enter the realm of the shadow market, a world of whispered deals and tactical liquidations that would make a film noir director blush. In the next part, we are going to dive into the information war of the 1930s real estate market and the rise of the private detective agent. You will see how the Great Depression and the Golden Age of Hollywood combined to create the most aggressive real estate tactics in American history. What you think you know about distressed property is about to be turned upside down. Stay tuned because the real drama is just starting to unfold. The year is 1932, and the optimistic glow of the Roaring Twenties has been replaced by the stark, high-contrast shadows of the Great Depression. In this era, the real estate market didn't just slow down. It underwent a brutal Darwinian transformation. If you were a real estate agent during this time, you weren't just competing with other agents, you were competing with the bank, the sheriff, and the crushing weight of a national economic collapse. This is where the divorce real estate agent evolved from a specialized salesperson into an intelligence operative. In the 1920s, divorce was a lifestyle choice for the burgeoning middle class. In the 1930s, it became a survival tactic. Property was no longer just an asset. It was a liability that could drag both parties into total insolvency. To understand the mechanics of this shadow market, we have to look at the cinematic shift from the bright, airy comedies of the previous decade to the gritty, cynical world of early film noir. Cinema in the 1930s began to treat the home as a place of entrapment. Films like those produced by Warner Brothers during this period showcased a darker reality: the domestic space as a site of tension, debt, and desperation. This reflected the United States public's reality. Real estate agents, ever the students of the silver screen, began to adapt their marketing and their methods. They realized that the information they held, knowing who was behind on their mortgage and whose marriage was failing, was more valuable than the land itself. Imagine a character named Frank in 1934. Frank is a real estate agent in a major metropolitan hub like Chicago or New York. In the 2026 market, Marcus might use AI-driven data scraping to find motivated sellers, but Frank had to rely on a more analog form of social engineering. He spent his mornings at the county clerk's office, not just looking at property transfers, but looking at the lease pendants filings and the divorce petitions. He was looking for the overlap. Historical trends show that during the 1930s, the intersection of foreclosure and divorce created a specific kind of double-distressed asset. Frank's job was to intervene before the sheriff arrived. He would approach the warring couple with a proposition: sell now, split the remaining equity, and avoid the total loss of a public auction. This was the birth of the modern short sale, disguised as a domestic mediation. The potential outcomes for Frank's clients were binary: either cooperate with a specialized agent to salvage some capital, or lose everything to the bank. Cinema reinforced this pressure. Movies of the era often depicted the mortgage-holding villain, a trope that made the real estate agent look like a savior by comparison. The agent became the fixer, who could make the problem disappear quietly. This required a level of discretion that bordered on the conspiratorial. This is the origin of the shadow market, a network of agents, lawyers, and private investigators who moved property behind closed doors to avoid the stigma of a public failure. Case studies from the 1930s reveal that high-profile divorces in Hollywood were the ultimate testing ground for these tactics. When a major star's marriage dissolved, the studio's fixers would work with specific real estate agents to liquidate the couple's sprawling estates. They couldn't just put a sign in the yard. That would invite the tabloids and potentially trigger a morality clause in the star's contract. The agent had to find a buyer who was wealthy enough to afford the property but discreet enough to keep the transaction out of the trades. This led to the development of the pocket listing system, which remains a cornerstone of high-end real estate in 2026. These weren't just sales. They were carefully choreographed PR maneuvers. Let's look at the step-by-step process of a 1930s shadow sale. First, the agent would cultivate a relationship with a divorce mill lawyer. The lawyer would provide the agent with a lead as soon as a petition was drafted but before it was filed. Second, the agent would conduct a silent appraisal. They would visit the property under the guise of a social call or an insurance inspection to avoid alerting the neighbors. Third, the agent would tap into their private list, a group of investors who specialized in buying distressed properties with cash. By the time the divorce was public, the property was already under contract. This prevented the divorce discount that typically occurs when a buyer knows a seller is desperate. The visual language of film noir played a massive role in how these properties were perceived. In noir, the house is often a place of shadows, sharp angles, and hidden rooms. This aesthetic began to influence property staging. Agents found that by highlighting the architectural drama of a home, they could appeal to a buyer's sense of mystery and sophistication, distracting them from the fact that they were buying a home born of tragedy. They were selling the glamour of the fall. This is a sophisticated psychological tactic, converting a negative emotional history into an aesthetic asset. Data from the 1930s indicates that while the overall real estate market was in a tailspin, the volume of transactions in these niche, high-conflict sectors remained surprisingly stable. People always need to get divorced and property always needs to be divided. The agents who thrived were those who could navigate the legal complexities of community property versus equitable distribution, concepts that were being refined in the courts during this very decade. They had to be part lawyer, part psychologist, and part detective. Imagine if Marcus, our 2026 investor, tried to use these 1930s tactics today. While the tools have changed, from handwritten ledgers to blockchain-verified titles, the core human psychology remains identical. The information war is still about who knows what and how fast they can act on it. In the 1930s, the real estate agent's most powerful tool was the telephone and a handshake with the judge's clerk. Today it's an algorithm. But the lesson from early cinema is that the story you tell about a property determines its value. If the story is one of failure, the price drops. If the story is one of exclusive opportunity and discrete transition, the value holds. The Great Depression also forced a professionalization of the industry. The National Association of Real Estate Boards, the predecessor to the NAR, began to crack down on the more predatory detective agents. They realized that for the industry to survive, it needed a veneer of ethics. This led to the first major codes of conduct regarding the disclosure of a seller's motivation. However, the shadow market didn't disappear. It just went deeper underground. It became a specialized skill set passed down from mentor to protege in the smoke-filled backrooms of real estate offices. We are now seeing the convergence of three powerful forces: an economic crisis, a shifting legal landscape for marriage, and a cinematic style that glamorizes the troubled home. This trifecta created the blueprint for the modern real estate powerhouse. But as the 1930s drew to a close and the world moved toward war, the real estate market was about to face its biggest challenge yet. The suburban boom was on the horizon, and with it, a whole new way to fail at the American dream. What happens when the shadow market goes mainstream? What happens when every suburban developer becomes a divorce specialist by default? In the next part, we are moving into the 1940s and 50s, the era of the Levittown trap, and the post-war split. We will examine how the GI Bill and the explosion of the suburbs created a golden cage that made divorce real estate more profitable and more dangerous than ever before. You will see how the perfect American home was actually designed to be liquidated, and how agents used the rise of television to target the suburban refugee. The stakes are rising, and the methods are getting even more sophisticated. You won't want to miss how the 1950s nuclear family actually fueled the greatest real estate turnover in history. The year is 1946, and the United States is standing at the precipice of the greatest residential construction boom in human history. The soldiers are coming home. The GI Bill has turned the dream of homeownership into a federally backed reality, and the nuclear family has become the primary unit of American consumption. But beneath the fresh paint of the newly minted suburbs, a structural flaw was beginning to emerge. The divorce real estate agent of this era had to pivot from the gritty urban shadow market of the 1930s to the manicured lawns of the suburban trap. In this part of our masterclass, we are dissecting how mass-produced housing and the post-war social pressure cooker created a high-velocity turnover market that redefined the professional real estate landscape. To understand the 1940s and 50s, we have to look at the Levittown model. William Levitt didn't just build houses, he manufactured them on an assembly line. This was the Fordism of real estate. For the first time, houses were truly standardized units. For a divorce real estate agent, this standardization was a revolutionary development. Imagine if you are an agent in 1952. You don't need to spend hours researching comps or unique architectural features. If a couple in a Levittown Cape Cod model is splitting up, you already know the exact square footage, the cost of the materials, and the market value based on the 10 other identical units that sold that month. This allowed for a volume-based business model that was previously impossible. Historical trends show that as the complexity of the house decreased, the speed of the transaction increased. Now let's look at the cinematic transition. The gritty, high-contrast film noir of the early 40s began to give way to the suburban melodrama and the Technicolor perfect family films. However, these films often contained a subtext of domestic confinement. Movies like All That Heaven Allows or The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit showcased the suburban home as both a trophy and a cage. Cinema was coaching the American public on a new kind of tragedy, the realization that the perfect home didn't solve the perfect marriage. The real estate agent became the person who provided the key to the cage. They were the exit specialists for a generation that had been sold a dream they couldn't maintain. Imagine a character named Betty in 1955. Betty lives in a brand new development in Long Island. Her husband, a returning vet, used his GI Bill entitlement to buy their home with a minimal down payment. But the marriage is failing under the weight of post-war expectations. In 1955, the social stigma of divorce is still massive. Betty can't just put a for sale sign in the yard without alerting the entire PDA and the neighborhood watch. This is where the 1950s real estate agent mastered the social cover story. The agent would market the home under the guise of an executive transfer or an upgrade to a larger estate. They weren't just selling a house, they were managing Betty's reputation. This era also saw a critical change in the financial and legal landscape. The Internal Revenue Code of 1954 introduced significant changes to how capital gains on a primary residence were handled. For a couple in the middle of a divorce, the timing of the sale became a high-stakes chess match. If they sold before the divorce was finalized, the tax implications were vastly different than if one spouse bought out the other and sold later. The real estate agent had to be well-versed in these potential outcomes. They had to work in lockstep with the husband's accountant and the wife's attorney to ensure that the equity split didn't evaporate into federal taxes. This professionalization of the divorce team, the agent, the attorney, and the CPA, became the standard operating procedure that we still see in 2026. Case studies of suburban developments in the mid-50s reveal a fascinating trend: the 2-year turnover. Many of these GI Bill homes were being sold within 24 to 36 months of purchase. While some of this was due to genuine upward mobility, a significant percentage was due to domestic dissolution. The real estate agents who dominated these suburbs were those who became neighborhood specialists. They didn't just wait for a phone call. They embedded themselves in the social fabric. They joined the country clubs, the bowling leagues, and the church committees. They were looking for the telltale signs of a failing marriage: the long hours at the office, the separate cars, the neglected lawn. In the 1950s, a brown lawn in a sea of green was often the first lead a divorce agent would follow. Step by step, the 1950s agent refined the full-service liquidation. Unlike the urban sales of the 30s, a suburban divorce sale often involved the entire contents of the home. Because these homes were often sold turnkey to other young families, the agent would frequently organize the estate sale as part of the listing agreement. They were managing the disposal of the dream piece by piece. This included the station wagon in the driveway and the brand new General Electric appliances in the kitchen. The agent became a project manager for a life in transition. Let's bring this into 2026. Imagine Marcus, our modern real estate expert, looking at a 1950s listing agreement. He would see that the language of lifestyle and modernity hasn't changed, but the leverage has. In the 50s, the leverage was the GI Bill and the low interest rate environment. In 2026, the leverage is often emotional equity and time to liquidity. Marcus realizes that the 1950s agent was the first to truly weaponize curb appeal. They understood that in a neighborhood of 500 identical houses, the house that looked the most stable would sell the fastest. They were using visual narrative to distract buyers from the domestic chaos that prompted the sale. The data suggests that the suburban boom actually accelerated the divorce rate by isolating women in residential enclaves, away from the support systems of the urban core. This residential isolation is a recurring theme in mid-century cinema, often portrayed through wide, lonely shots of a housewife staring out a picture window. The real estate market capitalized on this isolation. When the break finally happened, The agent was the only person Betty felt she could trust because the agent promised a clean break and a new beginning in a different, equally anonymous suburb. But there is a darker side to this post-war expansion. As the suburbs grew, so did the redlining and covenants that restricted who could buy and sell. The divorce real estate agent was operating within a deeply segregated and controlled environment. If a domestic liquidation occurred in a restricted neighborhood, the agent had a dual responsibility: settle the divorce and protect the neighborhood's demographics. This added a layer of gatekeeping to the profession that is a somber chapter in American real estate history. What happens when the perfect suburb begins to age? What happens when the 1950s nuclear family gives way to the counterculture of the 1960s? In the next part, we are moving into the psychological turn of the 1960s and 70s. We will examine how the no-fault divorce laws changed the game forever, making the real estate agent a central figure in a new kind of property warfare. You will see how cinema transitioned from the suburban melodrama to the divorce comedy and the splatter film, and how real estate marketing adapted to a world where the family unit was officially deconstructed. We are about to enter the era of the War of the Roses, where the house isn't just an asset, it's a weapon of mass destruction. The next part of this masterclass is where the gloves truly come off. Stay with us. The year is 1969, and the cultural landscape of the United States is being hit by a series of tectonic shifts that will forever alter the DNA of American real estate. We are moving out of the curated, high-gloss perfection of the 1950s and into an era of raw, unfiltered deconstruction. On January 1, 1970, California Governor Ronald Reagan signed the Family Law Act of 1969, officially introducing the concept of no-fault divorce to the American legal system. This single piece of legislation acted as a demolition ball to the traditional residential market. Before this, obtaining a divorce often required proving grounds like adultery or extreme cruelty. Now, a couple could simply cite irreconcilable differences. For the divorce real estate agent, this was the equivalent of the gold rush. The barrier to exit had been removed, and the resulting flood of inventory required a new kind of professional, the conflict resolution specialist. To understand the 1970s agent, we have to look at the cinematic mirrors of the time. The 1960s ended with films like The Graduate, which used the architecture of the suburban home as a symbol of hollow, glass-walled isolation. By the mid-1970s, cinema was obsessed with the domestic explosion. Films like Kramer vs. Kramer or Scenes from a Marriage showcased the home not as a sanctuary, but as a site of strategic asset division. The real estate agent was no longer just a person with a set of keys. They were the person standing in the middle of a literal war zone. Historical trends suggest that the divorce rate in the United States doubled between 1960 and 1980, jumping from 2.2 per 1,000 people to a staggering 5.2. This wasn't just a social trend. It was a massive untapped pipeline of forced liquidations. Imagine if you are a character named Gary in 1974. Gary and his wife Susan bought a split-level ranch in the San Fernando Valley in 1967 for $30,000. By 1974, despite the national economic stagnation and rising inflation, their home is worth nearly $65,000. The problem? They are getting a divorce under the new no-fault laws, and neither one can afford to buy the other out because mortgage rates are climbing toward 10%. They are trapped in a house they both hate, holding an asset that is growing in value, but impossible to split without a sale. This is the 1970s real estate trap. Enter the agent, a professional who now has to manage two clients who refuse to speak to each other, two separate attorneys, and a ticking clock dictated by the court. The potential outcomes for Gary and Susan are heavily dependent on the agent's ability to navigate the new legal reality of community property. In California and several other states, the law now mandated an equal split of assets acquired during the marriage. This meant the agent had to be a master of the equity harvest. They weren't just selling a house, they were conducting a forensic audit of a life. Case studies from this era show that agents began to specialize in the hostile listing. This involved a step-by-step process that is still used by elite agents in 2026. Step 1 was the separate intake. The agent would meet Gary at a diner and Susan at the house, ensuring their stories about the home's condition and their expected price point aligned. Step 2 was the neutral staging. In the 50s, staging was about making a house look like a happy home. In the 70s, divorce staging was about making the house look like a blank slate. The agent would insist on removing all family photos and personal mementos that could trigger an emotional outburst during a showing or worse, alert a savvy buyer that the sellers were desperate. The 1970s also introduced the era of stagflation, where high inflation and slow economic growth made traditional selling difficult. Real estate agents had to get creative. They began using techniques like the seller carryback or the lease option to move properties in a high interest rate environment. In a divorce situation, this was incredibly complex. How do you structure a seller finance deal when the two sellers are no longer on speaking terms? The agent had to act as the trustee, managing the payments and the emotional fallout. This required a level of professional liability insurance and legal knowledge that pushed the industry toward the highly regulated version we see today. Let's look at the data of the mid-70s. The inventory of homes for sale in many suburban markets was being bolstered by what analysts called the divorce turnover. Unlike a typical seller who waits for a peak market, a divorce seller often has a court-mandated deadline. This created a consistent floor for the market. Even when the economy was struggling, people were still getting divorced and houses were still being sold. The real estate agent became a recession-proof professional by leaning into the one thing that never stops: domestic change. They were the original distress specialists, long before the term was popularized by house flippers. Cinema in the 1970s also began to use the house as a character in horror and suspense. Think of the 1979 classic The Amityville Horror. While it is a ghost story at its core, it is a story about the financial and emotional stress of a new family moving into a house with a dark history. Real estate agents of the era actually had to deal with the legal concept of stigmatized property. If a house was being sold due to a high-profile or violent divorce, did the agent have to disclose that to the next buyer? This led to the development of the disclosure forms that Marcus, our 2026 investor, would recognize as the cornerstone of every transaction. The 1970s taught the industry that the emotional history of a property could be just as significant as its structural integrity. Now, imagine Marcus in 2026 looking back at the 1970s. He sees an era where the real estate agent finally shed the image of the friendly neighbor and became a high-stakes negotiator. He sees the birth of the 1031 exchange and the professionalization of property management. But most importantly, he sees the rise of the psychological sale. Agents in the 70s realized that if they could manage the stress of the sellers, they could control the price. They started using third-party appraisals not just for the bank, but as a tool to ground the warring spouses in reality. If Gary wants $80,000 and Susan wants $50,000 just to be done with it, the agent uses the appraisal to provide a neutral, cold, hard number that neither party can argue with. This era also saw the rise of the woman as a power player in real estate. As the divorce rate rose, many women entered the workforce, and real estate was one of the few fields where they could achieve high-level success quickly. These female agents brought a new level of empathy and tactical communication to the divorce niche. They understood the stakes for the wife who was losing her primary source of stability, and they knew how to talk Gary down from his defensive posture. This shift in the gender dynamics of the industry mirrored the cinema of the time, where women were no longer just the subjects of the drama, but the protagonists taking control of their own lives. The 1970s ended with a massive spike in housing prices, fueled by the baby boomers hitting their prime buying years. This created a paradoxical situation for the divorce real estate agent. The very houses they were liquidating were becoming the most valuable assets their clients would ever own. This led to the era of the high-stakes equity battle. People weren't just fighting over who got the toaster. They were fighting over $100,000 in unrealized gains. The agent was the only person who could turn that paper wealth into actual cash. But as the 1980s dawned, the game was about to change again. We were moving from the era of the split-level ranch to the era of the McMansion. The stakes were getting higher, the houses were getting bigger, and the divorces were getting much more expensive. In the next part, we are going to explore the 1980s, the age of greed and the War of the Roses. We will dive into the world of high-end luxury liquidations and the rise of the celebrity real estate agent. You will see how the 1989 film The War of the Roses became a cautionary tale for an entire generation of homeowners, and how agents learned to navigate the literal destruction of property as a divorce tactic. What happens when the sellers would rather destroy the house than let the other spouse have a penny of the equity? The 80s are about to show us the true dark side of the American dream. Stay tuned for the most explosive chapter in real estate history. Welcome to the 1980s, the decade of excess, the rise of the yuppie, and the birth of the 5,000 square foot dream known as the McMansion. This era fundamentally shifted the divorce real estate agent's role from a community mediator to a high-stakes asset manager. In the previous decades, we saw the house as a home or a stage. In the 1980s, the house became a leveraged financial instrument. With the deregulation of the banking industry and the 1981 Economic Recovery Tax Act, real estate investment was supercharged. However, this financialization of the domestic space meant that when a marriage collapsed, the explosion was no longer just emotional. It was a catastrophic financial event that could ripple through an entire portfolio. The cinematic landscape of the 1980s perfectly mirrored this shift. We moved away from the quiet suburban melodramas of the 50s and the gritty deconstructions of the 70s into the realm of the high-octane luxury thriller. Think of films like Wall Street or Fatal Attraction, where the interiors are as sharp as the business deals. But the definitive text for this era, and for every divorce real estate agent working today, is the 1989 masterpiece The War of the Roses. This film didn't just depict a divorce, it depicted the literal physical destruction of a luxury asset. It showed a couple who would rather see their multi-million-dollar mansion reduced to rubble than see the other spouse walk away with a win. Imagine if you are a character named David in the current year 2026. David is a tech consultant looking to buy a distressed luxury property in a high-end zip code like Beverly Hills or the Gold Coast of Chicago. He looks at the historical trends from the late 80s to understand why some of these legacy estates have such complex titles. What he finds is the legacy of the scorched earth tactic. In the 1980s, real estate agents began to encounter a new phenomenon: intentional property devaluation. When a spouse realized they couldn't keep the house, they would systematically destroy its value to ensure the other spouse received as little as possible from the court-ordered sale. Let's look at a case study from 1987. A high-profile couple in Greenwich, Connecticut, is dissolving their marriage. The house is a sprawling colonial worth $3 million. The husband, a hedge fund manager, realizes the court will likely award half the equity to his wife. Before the final appraisal, he removes all the custom copper piping, replaces the premium marble countertops with cheap plywood, and pours concrete down the main sewer lines. This isn't just spite. It is a tactical strike on the asset's liquidity. The real estate agent, who was hired to sell a $3 million jewel, is now standing in a construction nightmare. This forced the industry to develop the concept of the court-appointed receiver. Step by step, the legal system had to create a role where a neutral third party, often a specialized real estate agent, takes legal control of the property to prevent its destruction during litigation. The potential outcomes for agents in the 80s were massive commissions or massive lawsuits. To navigate this, the 1980s agent had to become an expert in forensic property management. They weren't just looking at the roof and the furnace, they were looking for signs of sabotage. They had to document every square inch of the property upon listing to protect themselves from claims that they allowed the property to deteriorate. This led to the professionalization of the home inspection industry. Historical trends show that the demand for detailed, pre-listing inspections spiked in the late 80s, driven largely by high-conflict divorce cases where the condition of the home was a moving target. Data from this era shows that while the divorce rate began to plateau after the 1970s spike, the complexity of property division skyrocketed. The introduction of the 1986 Tax Reform Act changed everything. It eliminated many real estate tax shelters and altered how capital gains were treated. For a couple selling a high-value home during a 1988 divorce, the tax bill could be the difference between a comfortable retirement and total insolvency. The real estate agent now had to sit in meetings with tax attorneys and CPAs, discussing the 1031 exchange and the primary residence exclusion. They were no longer just selling a lifestyle, they were executing a complex tax strategy. Now let's go deeper into the psychology of the McMansion. These homes were often built with a focus on outward appearance rather than structural integrity. They were the architectural equivalent of a leveraged buyout. When the market corrected in the late 80s, many of these homes were worth less than their mortgages. This created the first wave of what we now call the underwater divorce. Imagine if you are an agent in 1989. You have a couple who paid $800,000 for a new build in a fancy development 2 years ago. They are getting a divorce, and the house is now worth $700,000. They have no equity to split, only debt to share. This is where the divorce agent had to master the art of the short sale negotiation before the term was even popularized. They had to convince the bank to take a loss to allow the couple to untether their lives. Cinema in the late 80s also highlighted the gendered power struggle over the home. In The War of the Roses, the wife, Barbara Rose, is the one who finds and renovates the house, while the husband, Oliver, provides the capital. The house is her identity. It is his trophy. This dynamic was a common reality in 1980s real estate. Agents often found themselves caught between a spouse who viewed the home as a personal creation and a spouse who viewed it as a line item on a balance sheet. The agent's marketing strategy had to appeal to both. They had to sell the architectural soul of the home to one party and the cold, hard ROI to the other. Step by step, the high-end divorce agent of the 80s refined their intake process. First, they would conduct a separate walkthrough with each spouse to identify any contested items. The chandelier that Oliver Rose loved, or the specific built-in bookshelves that Barbara designed. Second, they would create a detailed inventory that was signed by both parties and their attorneys. Third, they would establish a secure lockbox system that logged every entry into the home, preventing the midnight raids where one spouse would strip the property of its valuables. This level of security and documentation is now the gold standard for high-conflict listings in 2026. As we look at this era, we see the real estate agent becoming a central figure in the American legal drama. They were the ones who had to deliver the news that the dream was over and the math didn't add up. They were the ones who had to stay calm while a client threw a crystal vase across a room. The 1980s taught the industry that a house is only as stable as the people living in it. But as the 1980s came to a close, a new technology was beginning to emerge in the basements of research universities and defense contractors. What happens when the real estate market moves from the physical world to the digital one? What happens when the divorce agent's greatest tool is no longer a telephone, but a global network of information? In the next part, we are moving into the 1990s, the Silicon Valley split and the rise of the digital listing. We will examine how the dot-com boom created a new kind of instant wealth and instant poverty, and how the internet changed the leverage in a divorce sale forever. You will see how cinema moved into the era of the hacker and the digital nomad, and how real estate agents learned to use the first primitive search engines to hunt for hidden assets. The 1990s are about to change the speed of the game. You won't believe how the first websites for real estate listings became a weapon in the hands of a savvy divorce attorney. The transition is coming, and it is going to be lightning fast. Stay tuned. The 1990s arrived with the screech of a dial-up modem and the shimmering promise of a paperless world. In this part of our masterclass, we are analyzing the most significant technological disruption in the history of property liquidation: the democratization of information. Before 1995, the real estate agent was the high priest of the market because they held the only copy of the Holy Grail, the multiple listing service book. If you wanted to know what a house was worth in a divorce settlement, you had to ask an agent. By 1999, that monopoly had vanished. The 1990s saw the birth of the digital listing, a tool that was immediately weaponized by divorce attorneys and frustrated spouses across the United States. To understand the cinematic parallel, look at the 1998 film You Have Got Mail. On the surface, it is a romantic comedy about bookstores, but underneath, it is a clinical study of the digital encroachment on physical space. The film mirrors the real estate industry's transition from the boutique, relationship-based model to the data-driven conglomerate model. Cinema in the 90s became obsessed with the concept of the digital footprint and hidden secrets. Films like Disclosure or The Net showcased a world where your assets and your identity could be tracked, manipulated, or deleted with a few keystrokes. For the divorce real estate agent, this meant that the shadow market we discussed in the 1930s was now being exposed to the harsh light of the World Wide Web. Imagine if you are a character named Sarah in the current year 2026. Sarah is a forensic real estate analyst. She is looking back at a property record from 1997 in Santa Clara County, California. This was the heart of the first dot-com boom. She sees a transaction where a modest 3-bedroom home sold for a price that seemed astronomical at the time. This leads us to our first major case study of the decade: the Silicon Valley split. In the mid-90s, thousands of young tech workers became overnight paper millionaires through unvested stock options. When these marriages dissolved, the family home was often the only tangible, illiquid asset they owned. The real estate agent was suddenly tasked with valuing a physical house against the volatile, hypothetical value of a startup stock. Historical trends during this period show that the speed of the market increased exponentially. In a typical 1990s tech divorce, the potential outcomes were dictated by the vesting schedule of the spouse's options. The agent had to coordinate the sale of the house to coincide with the specific fiscal quarter to minimize tax liability and maximize the equity split. This required a level of mathematical precision that had never been expected of real estate professionals before. They had to understand the difference between ISOs and NQSOs, and how those financial instruments interacted with the mortgage interest deduction. the real estate agent became a de facto financial analyst. Step by step, the 1990s agent had to integrate technology into their conflict resolution toolkit. First, they used the first iteration of digital cameras to create virtual tours, allowing warring spouses to see the staged house without having to step foot inside and risk an altercation. Second, they utilized early property search engines to provide the court with real-time market data, replacing the slow, anecdotal evidence of the past. Third, they began using email as a primary form of communication, which created a permanent, discoverable paper trail for every negotiation. In 1990, an agent's word was their bond. By 1999, if it wasn't in an email thread, it didn't exist in the eyes of the divorce court. Let's look at the data of the late 90s. The launch of platforms like Realtor.com in 1995 changed the psychology of the buyer. In previous decades, a divorce sale could be hidden behind a quiet listing. But once a property hit the internet, it was visible to the world. This created the phenomenon of the digital stigma. If a house sat on the market for more than 30 days, the digital record showed every price drop in every relisting. Savvy buyers began using this data to identify distressed sellers. If they saw a house listed in June, a price drop in July, and a listing change in August, they knew a divorce or a relocation was likely. The agent's role shifted from finding a buyer to protecting the seller's digital narrative. They had to learn how to refresh a listing to reset the days on market clock, a tactic that remains a staple of the industry in 2026. Cinema in the 90s also highlighted the rise of the independent, professional woman in real estate, often portrayed as a shark in a power suit. This reflected the reality that more women were graduating with business degrees and taking over the management of high-value divorce listings. They brought a surgical approach to the transaction. They weren't there to hold anyone's hand. They were there to liquidate the asset and move on to the next one. This shift mirrored the broader cultural move toward a more transactional, less emotional view of marriage and property. Imagine a character named Michael in 1996. Michael is a real estate agent in Seattle, another tech hub. He is handling a divorce sale where the husband has hidden assets in offshore accounts. The wife's attorney uses the newly public property records to find a vacation home Michael's client bought under a shell corporation. This is the moment the real estate agent becomes a witness. Because property records were being digitized and made searchable, the agent could no longer claim ignorance about the ownership structure of a property. They were now part of the global information network. This led to the implementation of more rigorous Know Your Customer protocols within the real estate industry, as agents tried to avoid being caught in the middle of fraud or money laundering schemes disguised as domestic disputes. By the end of the 1990s, the American dream had been digitized. The house was no longer just a place to live or a trophy to show off. It was a data point in a global market. The divorce real estate agent had survived the transition from the physical book to the digital screen, but they were about to face a challenge that no algorithm could predict. As the clock ticked toward the year 2000, the dot-com bubble was beginning to hiss, and a new financial monster was being born in the subprime mortgage markets of the suburban United States. What happens when the information is free but the money is fake? What happens when every American is given a loan they can't afford, only for their marriage to collapse just as the interest rates reset? In the next part, we are moving into the 2000s, the subprime split and the Great Recession. We will examine how the 2008 financial crisis turned the divorce real estate agent into a survivalist. You will see how cinema moved from the optimism of the 90s to the apocalyptic realism of the mid-2000s, and how the short sale became the only language the market spoke. We are about to enter the darkest chapter of the 21st century housing market, where the house wasn't just a weapon, it was a tomb. The era of the foreclosure divorce is coming, and it is going to rewrite everything you think you know about real estate equity. Stay with us for part 8. The decade of the 2000s began with an artificial sense of invincibility. The United States had survived the Y2K scare, and the capital previously tied up in the volatile tech sector began to flow into what seemed like the safest bet in history, suburban dirt. This era saw the transition from the real estate agent as a professional negotiator to the real estate agent as a volume-driven loan facilitator. But by 2008, the music stopped. In this part of our masterclass, we are analyzing the most brutal collision in the history of the American domestic space: the foreclosure divorce. This was a period where the traditional rules of property liquidation were set on fire, and the real estate agent had to evolve into a survivalist and a debt mitigation expert just to keep their license. To understand the cinematic shift, we must look at how the silver screen moved from the polished, aspirational lifestyle of the 90s to the gritty existential dread of the mid-2000s. Films like Revolutionary Road, released in 2008, may have been set in the 1950s, but they were consumed by a public that deeply resonated with the idea of the suburban home as a psychological and financial trap. Cinema began to reflect a world where the house was no longer an asset but a weight. We see this in films like The Pursuit of Happiness or later in The Big Short, which showcased the systemic failure of the housing market. For the divorced real estate agent, this meant that their clients weren't fighting over who got the equity, they were fighting over who was going to be stuck with the debt. Imagine a character named James in the current year 2026. James is a middle-aged professional who is still navigating the credit repercussions of his parents' 2008 divorce. Historical trends during the mid-2000s created what economists call the underwater divorce. In 2006, at the peak of the bubble, a couple in a market like Las Vegas or Phoenix might have purchased a home for $500,000 with an adjustable rate mortgage and zero down payment. By 2009, that same house was worth $250,000, and their interest rate had just reset. When the marriage failed, they didn't have an asset to sell. They had a $250,000 deficiency. The real estate agent's role was no longer about marketing. It was about bank negotiation. This led to the rise of the short sale specialist. In a short sale, the lender agrees to accept less than the full amount owed on the mortgage to allow the property to be sold. For a divorcing couple, this was a nightmare of coordination. Potential outcomes were no longer about profit but about damage control. The agent had to coordinate a step-by-step negotiation process with a bank that was likely overwhelmed and understaffed. Step 1: the hardship letter. In a standard short sale, you had to prove you couldn't pay. In a divorce short sale, the divorce decree itself became the evidence of hardship. The agent had to package the emotional destruction of the family as a financial justification for the bank to take a loss. Step 2 was the documentation of the deficiency. This is where the 2000s agent had to become a tax strategist. Until the Mortgage Forgiveness Debt Relief Act of 2007, if a bank forgave $100,000 of your debt in a short sale, the IRS considered that $100,000 as taxable income. For a couple already losing their home and their marriage, a $30,000 tax bill was the final blow. The real estate agent had to work with specialized accountants to ensure that the timing of the sale and the finalization of the divorce didn't trigger a catastrophic tax event. This required a level of legal and financial literacy that pushed the neighborhood agent out of the market, making room for the distressed property expert. Data from 2007 to 2010 shows a staggering correlation between mortgage defaults and divorce filings. Case studies from this era suggest that financial stress was the primary driver of domestic dissolution during the Great Recession. Real estate agents reported that their divorce leads were no longer coming from luxury attorneys, but from bankruptcy courts. This created a new kind of shadow market. Unlike the 1930s, where information was shared in backrooms, the 2000s shadow market was driven by the pre-foreclosure list. Agents would track houses that had received a notice of default and then cross-reference those addresses with recent divorce filings. It was a high-stakes, data-driven hunt for the most desperate sellers in the country. The psychology of the sale also changed. In the 1980s, we saw the scorched earth tactic where spouses destroyed property. In the 2000s, we saw strategic default. A couple would realize that neither could afford the house, and the house was worth half of what they owed. They would collectively decide to stop paying the mortgage, stay in the house as long as possible for free, and then let the bank take it. The real estate agent often had to convince these couples that a short sale was better for their long-term credit than a foreclosure. They were selling the potential outcome of a faster credit recovery. They were no longer selling a dream, they were selling a slightly less terrible nightmare. Imagine if James, in 2026, looks at the old loan documents. He sees the ninja loans: no income, no job, no assets. These loans were the gasoline on the fire of mid-2000s divorces. Because the income wasn't verified when the house was bought, it made the equitable distribution of the divorce almost impossible to calculate. If the husband claimed he made $100,000 to get the loan, but his tax return showed $30,000 to avoid child support, the real estate agent was caught in a web of perjury and fraud. They had to be incredibly careful not to become an accidental accomplice in mortgage fraud during the liquidation of a marital estate. Cinema in the late 2000s also moved toward the concept of transient America. Movies like Up in the Air showed a world where people were no longer anchored to their homes. The American dream of a 30-year mortgage and a white picket fence was being replaced by the reality of a 12-month lease and a carry-on suitcase. Real estate agents adapted by pivoting into property management. Many agents who specialized in divorce during the crash found that their best move was to help one spouse rent a smaller apartment while managing the marital home as a rental until the market recovered. This was the birth of the accidental landlord. And the agent was the one who managed the transition. The 2000s taught the real estate industry that the market can and will go down. It shattered the illusion of perpetual growth. For the divorce agent, this meant that they had to build contingency marketing into every listing. They had to prepare their clients for the possibility that the house might not sell for months, or that the bank might reject the offer at the last minute. They became experts in expectation management. This era also saw the rise of the first digital valuation tools like the early versions of the Zestimate. While often inaccurate, these tools gave the warring spouses a weapon to use against the agent's professional appraisal, adding another layer of conflict to the transaction. By 2010, the dust was starting to settle, but the landscape was unrecognizable. The suburban trap had been sprung, and millions of Americans were left picking up the pieces. But as the economy began its slow, grueling recovery, a new force was emerging. The rise of social media and the sharing economy was about to change the way we live, work, and divorce once again. What happens when the sharing economy meets a broken marriage? What happens when your house isn't just an asset, but an Airbnb business that needs to be divided? In the next part, we are moving into the 2010s, the Zillow era and the algorithmic agent. We will examine how the rise of iBuyers and social media marketing changed the leverage in a divorce sale yet again. You will see how cinema moved into the era of the digital lifestyle, and how real estate agents learned to use big data to predict a divorce before the couple even knew they were unhappy. We are entering the age of the high-frequency liquidation, and the speed of the game is about to become dizzying. Stay tuned for Part 9, where the algorithm takes over the American home. The decade of the 2010s ushered in the era of the algorithmic gatekeeper. This was the moment the real estate industry moved from the era of information democratization into the era of predictive analytics. For the divorce real estate agent, this meant the battlefield had shifted from the kitchen table to the smartphone screen. If the 1990s were about the digital footprint, the 2010s were about the digital heartbeat. By 2015, the real estate agent wasn't just reacting to a divorce. They were using big data to anticipate it. In this part of our masterclass, we are analyzing how the rise of platforms like Zillow, the emergence of iBuyers, and the complexities of the sharing economy created a high-frequency liquidation market that removed the human element from the most human of tragedies. To understand the cinematic parallel of this decade, we have to look at the rise of the surveillance thriller and the algorithm-driven narrative. Films like The Social Network or Ex Machina depicted a world where data was the ultimate power. In the realm of domestic drama, we saw films like Marriage Story, released in 2019, which utilized clinical, almost claustrophobic framing to show the procedural deconstruction of a life. Cinema was no longer just showing the drama of the split. It was showing the terrifying efficiency of the legal and financial systems that facilitate it. For the divorce real estate agent, the algorithm was the new director. Imagine a character named Marcus in the current year 2026. Marcus is a high-volume agent who specializes in what he calls algorithmic exits. He doesn't spend his time at the courthouse looking for filings. Instead, he uses proprietary AI software that tracks consumer behavior. He looks for historical trends that suggest a domestic shift, a sudden change in household spending, the cancellation of a joint gym membership, or a spike in searches for one-bedroom apartments in a different school district. By the time the couple has their first serious argument about the house, Marcus's targeted ads are already appearing in their social media feeds. This is the era of the predictive lead, where the agent arrives before the attorney. The potential outcomes for Marcus's clients in the 2010s and early 2020s were heavily influenced by the rise of the iBuyer. Companies like Opendoor, OfferPad, and for a time Zillow Offers. These companies used automated valuation models to provide a cash offer on a home within minutes. For a divorcing couple in a high-conflict situation, the iBuyer was a revolutionary tool for conflict avoidance. Step by step, the traditional friction of a sale was removed. No staging, no open houses, and no strangers walking through the master bedroom while one spouse is sleeping on the couch. The iBuyer allowed for a surgical strike. The couple would accept a slightly lower price in exchange for the speed and anonymity of a digital transaction. The agent's role shifted from a marketer to a facilitator of these algorithmic trades. However, this ease of liquidation came with a new psychological cost: the Zestimate trap. Throughout the 2010s, the Zillow Zestimate became the primary source of conflict in the divorce real estate world. Imagine a couple, Emily and David, in 2018. The real estate agent, using a professional comparative market analysis, values their home at $450,000. But Emily sees a Zestimate of $475,000, while David, looking at a different app, sees $430,000. Because the data was now public and updated in real time, it created a state of perpetual negotiation. The agent had to spend hours debunking the algorithm's flaws while managing the paranoia of two people who no longer trusted each other. Historical trends show that the volatility of these digital estimates increased the time spent in mediation by an average of 15% during this decade. Case studies from the 2010s also reveal the complexity of the sharing economy. If Emily and David used their basement as a top-rated Airbnb, the house was no longer just a residence. It was a revenue-generating business. When it came time to sell, how did the agent value the superhost status or the future bookings? This created a new niche in divorce real estate: the income property specialist. The agent had to work with accountants to value the digital reputation of the property as an intangible asset. They were no longer just selling four walls, they were selling a cash flow machine. If the house was sold, the business died. This led to a surge in creative settlements where one spouse would keep the property, but pay out a percentage of future rental income to the other, making the real estate agent a long-term auditor of the domestic arrangement. Data from the late 2010s indicates that the speed of property turnover in the U.S. reached record highs, fueled in part by the ease of these digital transactions. But the 2020 pandemic added a final chaotic layer to this decade. The Great Resignation and the rise of remote work meant that a divorcing couple could now flee to entirely different states while still maintaining their income. This created a boom in the cross-border divorce market. An agent in Austin, Texas would have to coordinate with an agent in Boise, Idaho, to liquidate a marital home while both spouses were already living in their next destination. The real estate transaction became entirely virtual, mirroring the shift in cinema toward the screen life genre, where the entire story is told through computer monitors and video calls. Now let's look at how social media marketing changed the leverage. In the 1950s, an agent joined a country club to find leads. In 2026, Marcus uses geofencing. If he knows a top-tier divorce attorney's office is located in a specific building, he can set a digital perimeter around that office. Anyone who spends more than an hour in that building starts seeing his ads for discrete property valuations. This is the ultimate evolution of the shadow market. It is no longer about who you know. It is about where your phone is located. This level of targeted marketing has made the divorce real estate niche one of the most competitive and technologically advanced sectors of the industry. Cinema in the 2020s has begun to reflect this algorithmic anxiety. Films like Parasite or Leave the World Behind show the home as a system that can be hacked, monitored, or turned against its inhabitants. The real estate agent is now the person who helps you disconnect from that system. They are the ones who wipe the smart home data, reset the security cameras, and ensure that the digital ghost of the marriage is erased from the property's operating system before the next buyer arrives. This is the final step in the professionalization of the divorce agent, the digital sanitization of the asset. As we reach the end of this decade, we see the real estate agent standing at a crossroads. The algorithm can provide the price, and the iBuyer can provide the cash, but neither can navigate the emotional minefield of a human life in transition. The agent who thrives in the 2020s is the one who can bridge the gap between the cold efficiency of the data and the raw reality of the doorstep. But what happens when the algorithm starts to make mistakes? What happens when the predictive analytics are wrong, and the market begins to fracture under the weight of its own automation? In our final part, Part 10, we are going to synthesize 100 years of history, cinema, and real estate. We will look at the current state of the market in 2026 and project the future of the American home. You will see how the divorce real estate agent became the most important figure in the preservation of the middle class, and how the lessons from the silent films of 1912 are more relevant today than ever before. We are heading into the finale, where we reveal the ultimate secret to surviving any real estate cycle. The credits are about to roll on the old world, and a new one is being built on the ruins. Stay with us for the conclusion. The culmination of a century of cinematic storytelling and real estate evolution brings us to the present day in 2026. We have traveled from the flickering black and white images of the silent era where the concept of a woman owning property was a radical plot point, to a high-speed digital economy where homes are traded with the click of a button. But as we stand in the current market, the fundamental truth remains. The divorce real estate agent is the ultimate navigator of the American domestic crisis. In this final part of our masterclass, we are synthesizing every historical trend, every cinematic trope, and every data point we have uncovered to reveal the structural reality of the modern real estate professional. We are moving beyond the algorithm to understand the enduring power of human mediation in a world of automated outcomes. To understand the cinema of 2026, we have to look at the rise of hyperrealism and the meta-narrative. Current films and streaming series no longer just depict divorce as a plot point. They often focus on the logistics of the split as the primary source of tension. We see characters who are as concerned with their credit scores and their mortgage interest rates as they are with their emotional healing. This reflects a United States public that is more financially literate, but also more financially precarious than ever before. For the modern real estate agent, the silver screen has successfully socialized the idea that a home is a temporary container for a life stage, rather than a permanent sanctuary. This shift in consciousness is the final victory of the real estate marketing machine that began in Fort Lee over 100 years ago. Imagine a character named Jordan in 2026. Jordan is a divorce real estate specialist working in a high-density urban market like Seattle or Austin. Jordan doesn't just sell houses. He manages the entire life cycle of the dissolution. His process is a masterclass in modern coordination. Step by step, Jordan implements a strategy that would have been unimaginable to the land peddlers of 1912. First, he uses blockchain-verified title searches to ensure there are no hidden liens or encumbrances before the property is even listed. Second, he utilizes high-end virtual reality staging to show potential buyers what the home could look like without the physical remnants of a failed marriage. Third, he uses smart contract technology to ensure that the proceeds of the sale are automatically and equitably distributed to both parties' accounts at the moment of closing. The potential outcomes for Jordan's clients are significantly more predictable than they were during the chaotic collapse of 2008. This is because the modern agent has access to a century of data. Historical trends suggest that properties sold during a divorce require a specialized approach to pricing. If you price too high, the house lingers and the emotional friction increases. If you price too low, you risk a lawsuit from a disgruntled spouse. Jordan uses a data-driven sweet spot, often aiming for a price that is 2% below market to trigger a multiple offer situation. This creates a sense of competition that forces the sellers to unify in the pursuit of a common goal: the highest possible payout. This is the psychological pivot of the master agent, turning enemies into business partners for a final, decisive transaction. Case studies from the mid-2020s show a fascinating emergence of the silver divorce real estate market. As the baby boomer generation reaches their 70s and 80s, the rate of divorce in this demographic has hit record highs. These are not first-time homeowners. These are people with multi-generational wealth, complex trusts, and significant tax liabilities. The real estate agent working with a character like Margaret, a 75-year-old selling a family estate she has lived in for 40 years, must be part archaeologist and part historian. The agent has to navigate 40 years of accumulated assets, unpermitted renovations, and deeply rooted emotional attachments. This is where the cinematic language of the 1950s, the house as a memory box, meets the cold reality of 2026 asset liquidation. Let us look at the data surrounding the 2026 housing inventory. A significant portion of available homes on the market continues to be driven by life transition events, rather than speculative investment. Even in high-interest rate environments, the divorce real estate niche remains immune to the typical market freeze. People may wait to upgrade their kitchen or move for a better view, but they cannot wait to separate their lives once a legal decree is in motion. This makes the divorce agent the most resilient professional in the industry. They are the market makers when no one else is buying or selling. They are the ones who keep the wheels of the economy turning by facilitating the constant redistribution of residential land. The ultimate secret to surviving any real estate cycle, as revealed by a century of history, is the mastery of the forced liquidation. Whether it was the Reno colonies of the 1920s, the shadow markets of the 1930s, or the short sales of the 2000s, the most successful agents have always been those who can find the opportunity in the inevitable. They understand that while a house is made of brick and mortar, its value is determined by the story we tell about it. Early cinema taught us how to tell those stories, and modern technology taught us how to amplify them. The real estate agent is the director of the final scene in a couple's domestic life, and their job is to ensure that when the curtain falls, the financials are as clean as the cinematography. Consider the role of the agent as a digital curator in 2026. When a house is listed, its entire digital history is available to the buyer. The old Instagram tags, the previous Zillow listings, the public records of police calls or domestic disputes. The agent must perform a digital cleanup, ensuring that the property is presented as a fresh start. They are essentially editing the movie of the house to remove the scenes of conflict and replace them with scenes of potential. This is the modern evolution of the 1920s staging techniques. Instead of just moving furniture, they are moving data points. Now, imagine if the public understood the full extent of this manipulation. The American dream was never a static goal. It was a product designed to be sold, broken, and sold again. The divorce real estate agent is the technician who maintains this cycle. As we look toward the 2030s, we see the emergence of co-living spaces and fractional ownership models that will make the division of property even more complex. The agent of the future will need to be a blockchain expert, a psychological mediator, and a cinematic storyteller all at once. The lessons we have learned from the early film industry in Hollywood, the importance of lighting, the power of narrative, and the necessity of the new beginning, will continue to be the primary tools of the trade. The credits are beginning to roll on this masterclass, but the story of the American home is far from over. We have seen how the cinematic portrayal of the divorcee evolved from a scandalous outcast to a powerful consumer. We have seen how the real estate agent evolved from a land peddler to a high-stakes strategist. But the most important lesson is that the intersection of cinema and real estate is not a coincidence. It is a symbiotic relationship that has defined the American middle class for over a century. The house is the stage, the divorce is the drama, and the real estate agent is the producer who ensures that the show goes on no matter what the market conditions are. What happens when the concept of ownership itself begins to dissolve? What happens when the next generation of Americans decides that the white picket fence was never worth the struggle? In our next deep dive, we will explore the rise of the permanent renter and the end of the residential asset. We will examine how the 2030s are preparing to replace the family home with the subscription-based living pod. You will see how the new cinema is already preparing us for a world without property, and how the real estate agent is pivoting once again to survive the death of the American dream. The next chapter is even more controversial than the last. Stay with us as we uncover the future of how we live, how we split, and who profits from the transition.